So thank you very much for this invitation, and sorry I couldn't make it this morning. I'm just going to follow up on the previous presentation, as my work closely relates to the predicament of Palestinian refugees. And in this paper, as it was just mentioned, my focus is on the body actually, and issues of domesticity. So on the body, the domestic affectivity, and kind of issues that usually don't get much emphasis in when we talk about forced migration, refugees, predicaments, whether in Europe or elsewhere. In my ethnography among Palestinian refugees, which I conducted together with a colleague across 3 countries and across various refugee camps in Lebanon, the West Bank and Jordan, part of it was actually related to memories and recollecting women's memories and experiences of the Nakba, the 1948 expulsion, but also of the 1967, and of the various and ongoing forced displacements that women and men continuously endure among Palestinian refugees, as we've just heard. Having read a lot of the literature, though, I realized that there was very little attention on the ways in which the body is implicated in this work of memory, and the ways in which the body actually is the not only the narrator very often, but also the subject that experiences loss and displacement. So in other words, I was trying to understand, or I actually gathered what I would call for women's embodied forms of memories that put an emphasis on the sensory, the perceptual options that have generally been neglected in or marginalized or even silenced in the obligation to narrate, to produce a counter-narrative, a counter-political history to the Zionist one that Palestinians have been, of course, very much on the forefront of doing as part of their fight for survival, really. So in this context, which is a nationalist context that has focused mainly on resistance, on revolution, and that was just mentioned, basically the body and the work of memory and the ways of narrating and what women narrate and remember as domestic aspects of their life, as the loss of domesticity, as the loss of affectivity, hasn't found really a place in what I would call, or Bishara Dumani, a Palestinian historian, calls the national rewriting of history. So my interest here is really on the memories and narratives of these women, who are usually elderly women belonging to the 48 generation, but who have endured many, many, many displacements across their lives. And what I would call memories and narratives that are contrapuntal to modern national sensibilities, with their emphasis on the ordinary, on the domestic, on the work of care, rather than on resistance and revolution. Of course, the work of the body is very important in a context where, usually, as we heard, women live in patriarchal societies and cultures, and where most of what they do is either inscribed in a Western liberal discourse of resistance to certain patriarchal attitudes, or as still embedded within domestic, gender dominated, hegemonic, normative constructions of gender roles in the private or domestic sphere. And what I was trying to understand is where to inscribe all this work of memory, all these narratives that I will give you some examples of in a minute. How to understand work of memory and narratives that do not inscribe themselves into this framework, that are also not interested or cannot, simply lack the vocabulary, lack the skills, lack the interest in more universal text centers, facticity-oriented, mentalist kind of language of historical facts, which have, of course, been very relevant and important and crucial in the Palestinian fight for self-determination. But still, there is a huge amount of people who do not, especially elderly women, who do not produce these kind of text centers, mentalist, universalist narratives. So I was trying to look at the semantic legitimacy about representations that are other vis-a-vis these mainstream ones. And the underlying question of this kind of work is Judith Butler's work on war and especially the question she asks in her work on performative politics and the politics of effects, when she wonders who is the subject who can take responsibility for building a future after a loss, after war and violence. How does a new subject emerge contingently, that is not deterministically from the ravages of war? Is a subject possible who might now transversely splitting between the public and the private, between the very site, becoming the very site of that transversal? And this question all serve a larger one, namely how a social form for the subject might emerge that would be capable not only of apprehending the war and narrating it and its causes as well as its devastating losses, but of struggling for a different future, for a democratic political form in the aftermath of war. So who is the subject that can assume responsibility for the future? And I think that confining the work of memory, or what I call the embodied memories of these refugee women who have been going through several displacements, would be to not be able to answer this question, or to marginalize a huge, very important element of that should form part of that question. Now, another, do you know how? Yeah, another question that is kind of lies in the background of my work is the question of agency again, because in the Palestinian context we are very much driven by an idea of the body that is either a body that resists or a body that succumbs, and the body that resists is the body that we have seen also in the Kurdish women resistance movement, a body that takes place in the public, that challenges directly the occupation or the violence of the war, or a body that in a way still inhabits the domestic sphere and if anything, again, acquires agency in mobilizing domestic and reproductive tasks for the cause. So what about all these women who are not engaged neither in resisting nor in succumbing or mobilizing their domestic role, but they are fully inhabiting their domestic sphere? How to, in other words, how to actually politicize the domestic in its own terms, or the sphere of emotion, or the sphere of the body itself? So in the several testimonies and accounts of women, actually what gains prominence is, for example, violence and forced displacement, not so much as the loss of a homeland, for example. Women don't talk about the loss of their losses as in terms of the loss of a homeland. They don't often refer to the iconography of Palestinian resistance or nationalism in terms of Palestine, as we know, as a mother figure or as a woman figure violated, but they actually talk about the loss in terms of a loss of a home. Very often they recall the moment when they escaped in terms of, we were having breakfast and we had to leave. Very often the loss of home is translated into the loss of intimacy, not only the loss of intimacy in terms of the impossibility of having an intimate relationship with their family or kin, but the fact that their bodies were exposed to foreign gazes, to people unknown to them, and they had to very often reconstruct a sort of domestic atmosphere, a domestic context in displacement, and several times, not only once. So very often the stories of these women are stories of multiple displacements from one camp to the next, from one country to the next, and in which their role was the one of producing a family, caring for their kin, caring for their children, but in a context of complete loss of intimacy, a complete loss of sense. So I'm interested in the ethos of care that was put into this huge amount of movement, of mobility, of forced displacement. Very often the violence of the Nakba, the violence of expulsion, whether in 48, 67, or during the various other wars and forms of violence they had to be exposed to in the various countries where they were hosted, like Lebanon or Jordan, so the war of the camps or Black September are a few of these events. They are marked onto their bodies as traumas involving miscarriages, death, injuries, but also deprivation, as I said, of domestic space, of intimacy, compromised sexuality, having to have children in one room, living together with 10, 12 families sometimes. These are issues that are never really center stage in the way we understand forced migration, refugeehood. The experience of spatial disorientation throughout endless painful marches, and that's why my talk has as a title, Bodies That Walk, because one of the issues that women talked about a lot was their experiences of walking for days across unfamiliar landscapes, seeing places they'd never seen, having to do this with foreigners, with men and women who they didn't know, and the heroism that actually they had to go through in order to endure these experiences of violence. Of course, most of the literature on Palestinian forced expulsion has focused on rape, even if it was a taboo for many years. But I think that there have been other types of violation of women's sexual and intimate lives that were maybe less prominent and less politicized, but not less painful for them. So the loss that women narrate and feel pain for is not merely the loss of a national territory or of a nation, as I said. It is not experienced as the loss of a land, and it is rarely narrated in terms of the mise of the homeland. What gains prominence are accounts of the loss of home, the fears of separation, the collapse of social and cultural orders, and meanings caused by violence, displacement, destitution, and women's endeavor to contain the pain triggered by these events. Most of these women, displaced women, refugee women, have been married off in displacement, and very often they don't recall the dates. Going back to the issue of facticity, they don't recall their lives in terms of important political or historical dates, but in terms of rites of passage. So they remember the time when they were married, the time where they were given birth, and very often actually the historical facts are marking their domestic or ordinary events such as birth, death, and losses. I would like now to move, how much time do I have? 7 minutes. To give you a couple of stories that I think epitomize what I've been trying to say more theoretically. One is the story of Hassan, who's a refugee living in Baka camp in Amman, and she's sitting with Nasser in the courtyard of her house as we are conversing about their lives. We are sitting on the floor on a couple of thin foam mattresses covered with the colorful material which will become, again, in this condensed, intimate or domestic space, the beds for the children at night. Her legs crossed under the white thobe, her head leaning slightly on a light white mandil slipping down from her head onto her shoulders. Hassan's posture is common among women her age and status, expressing a long-awaited relaxation and freedom from hegemonic imperatives to embody and convey docility and modesty. As her body acquires the status of the authoritative narrator, her gestures and movements, her tone and jokes, her tired yet lively eyes convey fragility and resilience, fatigue and strength, the physical burden, and yet the high status derived from having given birth to 13 children. Her personal story is unique, and yet Hassan's body, clothing, and posture speak of a common experience of displacement and express the collective predicament of women who came from a peasant background and became refugee in '48 and many more times subsequently. Throughout her life, as I said, Hassan gave birth to 13 children, 2 of whom passed away soon after the birth. Under those harsh circumstances, Hassan breastfed her children, her daughters, and also the children of any woman who needed it. Whoever needed to go out to the market, she said with a proud, self-complacent smile, brought their children to me to be breastfed. And her friend Nasser confirmed, yes, she breastfed the whole camp. I saw that with my own eyes. So clearly, both women attributed to Hassan's bodily performance a heroic status, the expression of a hyper-nurturing power that incarnated, as well as an act of intergenerational solidarity among women. There is, however, another meaning that should be emphasized in Hassan's embodied memory. In the suspension and violent disruption of gender orders, forcibly enacted by the loss of place and space, Hassan extends her nurturing role beyond the domestic and intimate realm and suspends and reconfigures kin relations in the new shrunk microcosm of the camp, which is symbolically resignified as an extended family collectivity. And the kind of care and the spheres in which caring and nurturing role that refugee women are involved with very often extend beyond the immediate family. Very often you would go to women's houses and you wouldn't know that the neighbor is actually not the sister, but it's just the neighbor. And there is this sense in which a refugee camp has become an extended family. Although, I mean, people who have worked in camps know that there is a hate-love relationship vis-a-vis the camp, but there is a very strong sense in which this work of care and solidarity and among neighbors, especially women, was very crucial in enduring the circumstances of the camp and in creating meaning, in containing the pain of loss. Another example quickly that I would like to give, I mean, the story of Hassan actually carries on much more dramatically as she goes to Jordan in an unknown date, because she doesn't remember any date, to collect the pieces of a body that was exploded in a suicide attack bombing during the second Intifada, and she's the one allowed to go. And again, when she talks about this, which is of course a traumatizing event for her, she doesn't really talk about it in heroic terms or in the mainstream, through the mainstream language of, you know, martyrdom or resistance. She talks about it as, again, you know, her role in nurturing, containing the pain, in burying and bringing back what was left of these bodies to her family. Of course, I have no time to go into details about this. And another story I would like to share with you is the story of another woman who, in 48, I mean, throughout 5-6 years, lost 2 children she was pregnant with. Shot by, first time she was 9 months pregnant, she was shot by Israeli soldiers while she was out in one of their places of her displacement, not in a refugee camp, but in a village where they sought shelter after 48, and she was 9 months pregnant and she was shot while fetching water. And she talks about how, again, she talks about where it happened, how the house they lived in was a very restricted place where while she was basically having a miscarriage, her sister-in-law was giving birth. So these experiences of intense, you know, of birth and death within a very small microcosm that is the displacement shed, really, are also somehow stories of resilience, of heroism, I would say, that do not fit into the agency resistance kind of framework, but are very important, I think, to recollect and to analyze. What is interesting about the story of this woman is that she lost another baby throughout one of the further displacements she had, when she had to run away for kilometers. And again, the issue of the body that walked and the body that ran. Or as she was involved in being the one responsible for collecting whatever she could collect from the house that they were forced to leave. So she would come and go when there was an opportunity. Throughout all these very difficult, painful bodily efforts, she lost another baby. And the way she told us about this was that she was very preoccupied for her husband, who was the Mukhtar of the village in 48, a very important person, and she felt that she couldn't really leave him childless, with only at that point one daughter. So for 7 years she couldn't have children. And the fact that her preoccupation, her main preoccupation, was not about herself, and even in remembering the events, the painful, dramatic events, her worry was not about marking how heroic was her, or even in sort of in the language of martyrdom, that she lost children for the cause. Or it was about, you know, the ability to give her husband more children that she had possibly lost. And again, I mean, to me, what moved me to understand these kind of narratives in a different light was that the impetus to answer Judith Butler's question about what kind of subject can can be a subject that can not only apprehend the war and its losses, but anticipate a different future. And Muhammad's preoccupation for her husband, which would be read again in terms of, a patriarchal society pushing women to only exist insofar as they can reproduce, I found was very limiting to understand her work. That was an ethos, that what I would describe in an ethos of care, in an ethos of containing the pain of the war and of losses that ensue from war, and that basically, as anthropologist Vena Das argued, reconfigure the relationship between the ordinary and the eventful, as we always try to understand of agency as lying in the eventful and less much so as lying in the ordinary. So to conclude, basically, my work has been really involved in trying to make sense of these narratives, these embodied memories, that rather than unfolding every day, that rather than unfolding in nationalist discourse of violence and resistance, are work of memories and narrations that are developed through a plot in which violence is folded into memory, into ordinary life and relationships. Bodily narratives and memories here emerge as accounts of pain accompanying the loss of the ordinary, and women's work of care underscores their need to reconstruct intimacy, relatedness, and affectivity. And I think I'll stop here to speak for my 20 minutes. Thank you.